I lost my mother and after her, almost the whole family. They think that I appropriated her house. But the truth is that I just fulfilled the last will of the person who loved me the most. When my mother found out that she had terminal cancer, something in her shifted, like she had been carrying the weight of time for years and finally knew exactly what to do with it. There was no dramatic announcement, no teary family gathering. Just one quiet afternoon in her living room, with the late sun slanting through the blinds, when she looked at me and said, "Sarah, the house will be yours." I remember blinking at her, stunned, unsure I had heard her right. I'm the youngest of 5 and to be honest, I never expected to be the one she would choose. But she reached out, placed her hand over mine, and smiled in that tired way she'd been smiling ever since her diagnosis. "You've got those babies to think about," she said, "and I want them to have a roof over their heads that no one can take away." I'm 28. I have 4 young children under the age of 10, and every day is a swirl of sticky fingers, mismatched socks, and the endless rhythm of meals and laundry and kisses goodnight. We were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with paper-thin walls and neighbors who argued at all hours. My husband works long shifts and we've been scraping by, always one surprise bill away from panic. So when she told me the house would be ours, I didn't know what to say. It felt like a life raft thrown into the middle of chaos. Something solid, something ours. But behind the relief was a slow, creeping ache because I knew what it meant. It meant she didn't have long. It meant she was already thinking of the end, not just in abstract terms but practically, with signatures and keys and deeds. She had lived in that house for over 30 years, raised all of us within those walls, painted and repainted every room more times than I could count. And now she was giving it to me, not just as an act of love, but as her final gift, a way to keep us safe after she was gone. At the time, we were living in a cramped, second-floor apartment that always felt like it was bursting at the seams, with too many shoes by the front door and toys scattered through every room no matter how often I picked them up. I shared that space with my boyfriend James, who was 38, and our 4 children, our 5-year-old twins who had boundless energy and always managed to find new ways to turn the living room into a jungle gym, our sweet and sensitive 3-year-old son who still crawled into our bed in the middle of the night, and our baby girl who had just turned 1 and had started toddling from room to room with the wobble of a drunken sailor. Every corner of that apartment echoed with noise, with love, with chaos, and as grateful as I was to have a roof over our heads, I knew it wasn't enough, not for long. So when my mom offered us her house, it felt like a miracle. It was a big, sturdy 5-room home with real space for everyone to breathe, to play, to grow. The kitchen had room for a table that all 6 of us could sit around, and the backyard had grass, actual grass, for the kids to run barefoot through. It had a laundry room with more than one outlet, closets that didn't creak open in the middle of the night, and bedrooms where the children wouldn't have to be stacked 2 to a mattress. It was the kind of home I had never imagined I could give my children, and the kind of home where I could finally exhale. That summer, when my mother was still feeling more or less like herself, tired, yes, but still moving around the house, still cooking her favorite meals, still brushing my daughter's hair with a kind of quiet joy, she sat me down at the kitchen table and told me she had made things official. She had gone to the county office, spoken to a lawyer and filled out the paperwork to create a transfer on death deed with my name on it. It meant that when she passed, the house would automatically become mine with no court battles, no probate, no confusion. Just a clean, legal transfer that would honor her wishes without delay. It wasn't a rushed decision. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a clear, deliberate, and deeply thoughtful move on her part. She wanted to make sure that her grandchildren had a home, that I would never again have to worry about rent hikes or eviction notices or where we'd fit one more crib. And more than that, she wanted peace. She wanted to know that when her time came, there wouldn't be fighting or bitterness, just the security of knowing she had done everything she could to protect us. She signed that deed with a steady hand, looked me in the eye and said, "No one can take this away from you. This is yours now. It's your turn to make it a home." All my brothers and sisters already had their own houses. Some bought years ago, some inherited through marriage, and all of them settled in lives that, from the outside, looked secure and complete. They had mortgages, fenced-in yards, garages filled with tools and toys and holiday decorations, and none of them were juggling strollers in a 2-bedroom apartment while calculating whether the rent would go up again next year. I was the only one who still needed help, the only one whose life hadn't quite caught up with adulthood the way everyone else's had, and my mother saw that. She saw the way I stretched every dollar, how I stayed up late folding laundry in the same room where 2 of my kids were sleeping, how I said, "We're fine," even when we weren't. She knew that I wasn't asking for anything, I never had, but she gave it anyway because that's what love looked like to her. She didn't make speeches or write dramatic wills. She simply looked at the life I was trying so hard to hold together and said, "Let me give you a chance to breathe." Giving me the house wasn't favoritism, it wasn't taking something from anyone else. It was her quiet way of giving my children something solid beneath their feet, a foundation to grow from, and a way for me to finally step out of survival mode and into something steadier. After she died in November, the grief came in waves, sudden, sharp, and always heavier than I expected. But alongside the mourning came the practical realities, the paperwork, the phone calls, the quiet, numbing logistics of loss. That's when I found out she had medical bills. Not a mountain of debt, but enough to matter, enough to make me sit at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, wondering how we were going to make this work now that she was gone. James and I sat down one night after the kids had finally fallen asleep, and talked through every option we could think of, every angle, every number scribbled in the margins of our budget notebook. The house, thankfully, was almost paid off, just a small remaining balance on the mortgage, and we thought maybe we could buy it outright. Not just take over the deed from the transfer, but pay off what little was left, get a small loan if we had to, and then use the rest of what we could gather to settle the medical bills. It felt like the most respectful thing we could do, the least we could do, to take care of her final debts, to honor the gift she left us by keeping it clean, uncomplicated, paid in full. We weren't thinking of profit or equity or ownership in some cold, legal sense. We were thinking about family, about closure, about making sure nothing would come back to haunt us or complicate the future of the home she had given us. But then my oldest sister, Melanie, who was 43 and had always seen herself as the unofficial head of the family, stepped in like a storm I didn't see coming. She started making phone calls, sending messages, stirring up conversations that should have ended with my mother's signature on that transfer on death deed. With her usual calm, authoritative voice, she convinced the other siblings that Mom had never truly intended for the house to be mine. According to her, the deed was just a temporary arrangement, something practical and convenient while our mother was sick, a placeholder meant only to make the sale of the house easier once she passed. She told them that the real plan was for me to sell the house and then split the money equally among all 5 of us, that Mom had always been about fairness, that she would never favor one child over the others. She spun this version of events so smoothly, so confidently, that some of them started to believe it, even though there was no legal document, no letter, no voicemail, no shred of evidence to back it up. Just her word, delivered with certainty and a few well-placed mentions of what Mom would have wanted. And suddenly the home my mother had given me, her final gift to keep my children safe, was being framed as a betrayal, a stolen inheritance, a selfish act disguised as grief. Melanie had always been the one our mother leaned on for paperwork and appointments, the one who knew which form needed notarizing and where to find the bank statements, so it hadn't surprised any of us when we found out she'd been named the trustee of our mother's finances. She had access to everything, the accounts, the insurance details, the safe deposit box, even the passcode to our mother's phone. But when we asked her, gently at first, how much was left in the estate, whether there were any savings, coins, heirlooms, or valuables tucked away, Melanie dodged every question like it was an attack. She kept saying things were being sorted, that she needed more time, that she was still grieving, and it wasn't the right moment to talk about numbers. But somehow, it was the right moment to talk about selling the house. It became clear very quickly that she didn't want transparency, she wanted control. She refused to show us statements, wouldn't answer simple questions, and acted offended any time someone even implied that there should be some accountability. And yet, she was more than willing to demand a share of the home I was living in, the home our mother had legally and intentionally passed to me. One afternoon, not long after another tense phone call with Melanie, my sister Rachel came over to see the kids, bringing a few grocery bags of snacks and things she said were just little treats. It was one of those rare quiet days when the baby was napping, the twins were distracted by cartoons, and for a brief moment I thought maybe things were starting to settle, maybe we were finding our way back to being a family again. She was standing in the kitchen with me, unpacking some items onto the counter, when I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the tile. We both looked down at the same time, and there it was, a gold coin, round and old-looking, just lying there between our feet. Rachel froze. Her face went pale, and in a panicked blur she snatched it up, muttered something about it being part of a gift for Melanie, and shoved it back into her bag like a kid caught sneaking candy. She didn't explain. She didn't look me in the eye. She just kept unpacking, hands moving too fast, voice suddenly too cheerful. But in that instant something inside me clicked. I realized what I had been trying to ignore for weeks, that there had been a conversation, maybe several, and that in those conversations I had not been included. I wasn't part of the deal. Whatever decisions were being made about what was left of my mother's estate, Whatever quiet agreements had been formed about valuables, coins, or inheritance, they had already happened. They had chosen to divide those things among themselves behind closed doors, while painting me as the one being unreasonable for simply living in the house our mother gave me. They had made me the outsider in a family I had always believed would protect one another, especially in grief. And at that moment, standing barefoot in my kitchen with Rachel pretending like nothing had happened, I finally saw it for what it was, not a misunderstanding but a choice. When James was finally approved for the loan, after weeks of paperwork and waiting and holding our breath, I felt a wave of cautious hope wash over me. It wasn't just about numbers on a screen, it was about securing something permanent, something safe for our children, and honoring the promise my mother had made to me in her final months. We didn't plan to profit from the house or flip it or treat it like some kind of financial opportunity. We just wanted to make things right, to pay off the debts, and to keep the home she'd left us without strings attached or looming questions. So when I called Melanie to tell her the loan had gone through, I thought, maybe foolishly, that she would at least be relieved. Instead, her voice changed instantly, cold, clipped, defensive. "I don't agree with him buying a house," she snapped, like we had just proposed stealing family treasure instead of trying to pay off bills and live in peace. I reminded her as calmly as I could that it wasn't just about James. It was about 4 children, her nephews and niece, who needed a roof over their heads, a backyard to play in, a home that didn't feel like it could be taken away at any moment. But none of that mattered to her. Not the children. Not the history. Not the fact that our mother had gone through the effort to make the deed official in my name while she was still alive and sound of mind. All Melanie could see was her control slipping through her fingers. And in that moment it became clear. This was never about fairness or family legacy. It was about power. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left, after the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the whispered accusations and slammed phone calls, and I turned to a lawyer. I needed clarity, not emotion. I needed someone who could cut through the noise and tell me with certainty what my rights were and what my mother's intentions had truly set in motion. Sitting across from that lawyer, my palms sweating and my voice trembling just a little as I laid out every detail, every document, every message from my siblings, I braced myself for bad news. But instead I got the truth. The house was really mine. The transfer on death deed my mother signed was legal, binding, and unambiguous. There were no loopholes, no fine print that favored anyone else, no hidden clause that supported Melanie's story. The lawyer reviewed everything and assured me that I didn't have to sell the house to pay off the medical debts, because those debts were not tied to the property itself. They wouldn't force its sale, and no one, not Melanie, not Rachel, not any of them, had the power to take the home away from me. I could stay. I could raise my children in the house their grandmother left for them, let them grow up in a place filled with memories and love, not tension and fear. I left that office with tears in my eyes, not from anger, not from sadness, but from sheer, overwhelming relief. For the first time since my mother passed, I felt like I could breathe again. The house is ours just as she wanted. And we are home. I changed the locks the same day I found out what Melanie had been doing behind my back, because no amount of grief or family history could justify what felt like a slow, calculated robbery from my own sister. A neighbor, someone who had known my mother for years and had always waved kindly when we passed by, pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if we were moving. I blinked, confused, and said no. Why? That's when she told me she'd seen Melanie coming and going from the house several times while I was out, loading things into her car, sometimes with another person helping her. At first I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe she had come by to grab something sentimental, something small, an old photo, maybe one of Mom's scarves, but when I stepped into the living room, I saw the antique mirror missing from above the mantel. The cedar chest from the guest room was gone. A few chairs had vanished, along with the old quilt rack and several boxes of silverware that my mother had carefully packed away years ago. When I checked the kitchen, I nearly collapsed. Melanie had left the pantry open and empty and the refrigerator was unplugged. Later, James told me she had asked him weeks ago if he still needed the stove and fridge. She hadn't asked. She hadn't even told me. She had just come in like it was hers to take, as if my mother's death had made everything in the house up for grabs, as if the transfer on death deed didn't exist, as if I didn't exist. So I called a locksmith that afternoon. I changed every lock on every door, installed a security camera, and didn't say a word to her. Because nothing needed to be said. I had finally accepted that blood alone doesn't make someone safe. And sometimes, the worst kind of betrayal wears a familiar face. Melanie has made it her personal mission to turn everyone against me. My sisters, my brothers, even our father, who has grown quieter and more distant with each passing week, as if unsure what to believe or simply unwilling to take a side. She tells them all that I stole the house, that I manipulated our mother while she was sick, that I somehow tricked her into signing it over in a moment of weakness. She spreads these lies with such conviction, with such calm, persuasive certainty, that it's easy for those who weren't there to nod along, to question what they once thought they knew. She leaves out the part where I was the one who brought my mother soup every evening, who cleaned her sheets when she could no longer make it to the bathroom in time, who sat beside her as she drifted in and out of sleep during her final weeks. She doesn't mention the countless hours I spent at that house before and after her diagnosis, or how our mother called me her anchor during those last cruel months. None of that matters to Melanie because the truth doesn't serve her. She repeats her version of events again and again until it starts to sound real to those who don't want to look deeper. And the worst part is, they listen. They nod and agree and fall silent when I try to speak. They don't ask me questions. They don't come to me for my side. It's easier to believe the sister who has always spoken with authority, who has always seemed composed, even when she's rewriting history to suit her bitterness. So now I find myself isolated not just by grief, but by the slow, cold withdrawal of the people I once called my family. And all because I held on to the one thing our mother gave me, with love, with intention, and with the hope that it would keep her grandchildren safe long after she was gone. I had to convince myself more times than I can count, not to take her to court, not to let the rage and betrayal turn into a legal battle that would drag everything even deeper into the mud. But it wasn't easy, not after realizing she had taken my cash, emptied the little envelope I kept tucked away for emergencies, gone through my drawers and stolen the jewelry my mother had given me over the years, the same pieces she once said would be mine, someday. She even took the spare keys to my car and drove it off one night under the pretense of needing to borrow it, only to return it with the gas tank empty and a scratch on the passenger door that she pretended not to notice. And still I didn't sue. Not because I didn't have grounds, God knows I did, but because I didn't want my children to grow up watching their mother wage war against her own sister in court, surrounded by paperwork and depositions instead of love and stability. I just wanted peace. I just wanted to keep a roof over my children's heads, to honor my mother's wish without turning her final gift into a battlefield. This house wasn't supposed to become a source of pain. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a promise, a place where her memory could live quietly in the walls, not be shattered by arguments and betrayal. So I've stayed quiet, kept my head down, and kept showing up for my children, because even if no one else remembers what my mother said, I do. And that has to be enough. Relations with my family have been restored, but only partially, like a house rebuilt with mismatched bricks, functional but no longer familiar. We talk now in group chats and occasional birthday calls, but the warmth is different, thinner, like something essential burned away and was never replaced. They ask about the kids, they send pictures of their gardens and renovations, but there's always this quiet tension, an invisible wall between what's said and what's never brought up again. The trust that once bound us feels frayed, and even when I smile during those conversations, I can feel the gap stretching between us. They still see Melanie as older and more experienced, the one with the calm tone and the tidy explanations, the one who always knows how to spin the story just enough to sound wise rather than manipulative. And even though they don't say it outright, I know they still carry some version of her narrative in their minds, the idea that I overreacted, that I clung too tightly to something we all should have shared. My words seem to land with less weight now, like I'm the youngest again, always just a little too emotional, too reactive, too unsure in their eyes. I've learned not to expect validation, not to wait for someone to say, "We were wrong." We see it now. I've accepted that my truth won't carry the same authority in their minds, no matter how carefully I explain, no matter how much proof I offer. And maybe that's the hardest part, not the silence but the fact that when I speak they still listen to someone else more than they listen to me. I don't know if I will ever sell this house, and truthfully I hope I won't have to, not now, not in 5 years, maybe not ever. But if that day ever comes, if circumstances change and I have to make that decision, I will do so knowing exactly what this house has cost me, not just in dollars but in trust, in peace, in pieces of myself I've had to gather again and again. I will take into account every hour I spent fixing what was broken, every repair James and I paid for out of pocket, every memory carved into the walls by the sound of our children's laughter echoing through rooms that once held only grief. And more than that, I'll remember what I was denied, how I was pushed out of the rest of my inheritance, how I was left to fight for what was freely given, how I was forced to prove again and again that my mother's choice was not a mistake. They took everything else. The heirlooms, the jewelry, the coins, the dignity that should have come with a final act of love, but they didn't take this house. They tried. God knows they tried. But this place is ours now. Not just by law or by deed, but by every scraped knee on the porch, Every midnight feeding in the dark, every birthday candle blown out in the kitchen my mother once stood in. This house is our home. It is our refuge. And I will never let it be taken away from us again.